A hook for hanging pig carcasses, a soldering iron, all kinds of torture knives, and a trough rusted from human blood. It sends shivers down your spine when you imagine that little children died in terrible agony from these objects in 1986. The country was on an emotional high. Mikhail Gorbachev, the new General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, promoted to this position by Stalin's minister Gromyko. It was precisely in the areas where the nuclear explosion had the most severe impact, Ukraine, Belarus, and even the epicenter of the disaster in Pripyat, that the brutal murders of children began in the Moscow region that same year. On that day, 11-year-old Vanyusha Pavlov went to the forest to sled. The hill where his school friends were waiting was no more than 300 meters away. However, the boy never made it to the slope. Vanya vanished without a trace. Worried, his parents called the police. A search was organized immediately that same day. Alas, the child was not found alive. The boy's head was discovered near the railroad, hundreds of meters away from his body. It looked as if it had been torn off by a crazed beast. The police officers were chilled with horror as they examined the crime scene. Soviet detectives, of course, did not believe in mysticism, but even they were baffled. Where would wolves come from in the near Moscow region? And rabid ones at that, especially in an area under special surveillance by security services. Even today, when I drive along the Rublevo-Uspenskoye highway, I can't help but be amazed. Traffic police cars seem to be stationed behind every bush. Some young drivers probably think that local oligarchs have bought not only luxurious mansions, but also the police. In reality, this road has been under heightened surveillance for decades, ever since Soviet leaders settled here. And in such a district, an unprecedented murder occurred. The best police detectives were assigned to track down Vanya Pavlov's killers. Soon, they received the experts' conclusion. Predatory animals were not responsible for the child's death. A lone maniac had appeared in the area. But where to find this loner? Was he local or an outsider? Months passed. People gradually began to forget the terrible events. And then a new inhuman atrocity occurred. 14-year-old Andriusha Gulyaev loved skiing. After another outing, the teenager did not return home, neither for lunch nor in the evening. Fearing the worst, his parents filed a report with the police. Alas, their worst suspicions were soon confirmed. The boy's remains were found in the forest 3 days later. Just like Vanya Pavlov, he had been torn to pieces. It became clear that the killer was drawn to the Odintsovo district of the Moscow region for some reason. He was either a local resident or regularly came here on business. But there was still no lead to grasp onto. Suddenly, a crucial witness appeared at the police station, though he was brought in by his parents. This was a teenager, a friend of the deceased Andriusha Gulyaev. The boy claimed he knew who had kidnapped Andrei and remembered a suspicious stranger well. He had been seen lurking near a dacha settlement several times, and he had a tattoo of Fischer on his arm. For any Soviet person, the name Fischer was familiar. Bobby Fischer, the legendary American chess player, had become the 11th world champion by defeating our Boris Spassky. In the Soviet Union, chess was a cult game. It was played by both pioneers and respected retirees. I myself once earned the second rank. In 1975, Fischer was supposed to defend his title in a match against Anatoly Karpov, but the American made too many demands regarding the match conditions, and Karpov became champion without a fight. Despite this, Soviet chess player Anatoly Karpov was warmly congratulated by Leonid Brezhnev. But how were Bobby Fischer and the suspicious stranger with the Fischer tattoo connected? For now, this remained a mystery. Meanwhile, the teenager, the key witness to Andriusha Gulyaev's murder, continued to give testimony. Based on his words, a search alert was issued. The massive machinery of the Soviet investigation went into full swing. Analytical work did not stop. However, the titanic efforts turned out to be completely fruitless. There was no person in the Soviet Union with a Fisher tattoo on their right arm. What went wrong? Why did the well-oiled machine fail? The teenage witness was called in for questioning again and again, and one day the boy broke down in tears and confessed. He had lied. He simply enjoyed being the center of attention. This was a devastating blow. Thousands of police officers across the country had been chasing a boy's fantasy. Millions of those full-weight Soviet rubles had been wasted. The investigation had to start almost from scratch. The head of the investigative team, Vladimir Danilov, ordered a review of all archival cases. Even seemingly insignificant crimes were re-examined. And then, a few weeks later, the head of the Odintsovo Criminal Investigation Department uncovered a long-closed criminal case. In 1984, a certain criminal had attempted to kill a boy and then threw himself under a train. At the time, Leonid Glushko had no idea that he would soon come across a real witness. And finally, the investigation would have its first teenager who had managed to escape alive from the clutches of the Moscow region monster. The head of the Criminal Investigation Department in the Odintsovo district noticed a strange archival case. In 1984, a defenseless boy had been attacked by a man. A little more, and the boy would have died. Fortunately, a random passerby appeared on the dacha path at that moment. This saved the child's life. The attacker fled toward the railroad, and soon after, the body of a suicide was found near the train station. Now it seems unbelievable. In modern Russia, the death penalty has long been under a moratorium, but in the Soviet Union, people were executed even for economic crimes. I remember well the case of the director of the Elisevsky store. In 1984, Yuri Sokolov was convicted of numerous frauds. Today, a court would sentence him to 6 to 7 years. But back then, he received the highest punishment, execution, or as they said then, the top. The embezzler from the Moscow region managed to transfer all his money to relatives, and then the deputy director of a vegetable warehouse threw himself under a train. He never imagined that posthumously he would become a figure in a completely different criminal case, the attack on a teenager. The head of the criminal investigation decided to find the victim and question him again about the attack that had happened 3 years earlier. It turned out that the teenager was being held in a psychiatric hospital. The year 1988 arrived. The socialist bloc was already beginning to crack at the seams. In Poland, people increasingly trusted not the old-school communist Jaruzelski, but the leader of the Solidarity Union, Lech Wałęsa. In Czechoslovakia, the playwright and dissident Václav Havel was winning the people's hearts. Soon, both would become presidents. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the legendary film Asa hit the big screen. Movie theaters were packed. Viktor Tsoi gained immense popularity. All of this was observed with horror by the terminally ill Andrei Gromyko, the same Stalin-era minister who had recommended Gorbachev for the position of General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee. Andrei Andreevich realized the monstrous mistake he had made, but there was nothing he could do. In his final years, he rarely left his dacha. It was located in the western part of the Moscow region, exactly where the Moscow region monster was tearing children to pieces. In 1988, Sasha Sukhomlinov disappeared without a trace. The child vanished near Gromyko's dacha. The boy had gone to the train station, and his mother never saw him again. Never. When the child disappeared, the distraught parents called the police. By this point, the maniac's tally had reached 5 young lives. Who would be next? Whose child would not return from an ordinary walk or fail to reach the store? It wasn't just ordinary residents who were worried. The 9th Directorate of the KGB of the USSR was responsible for the security of the retired Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gromyko, and his family. The officers of the Special Service were nervous. What if the beloved grandson, who often visited his grandfather, disappeared? The case of the Moscow region monster was placed under the highest level of scrutiny. Alas, there were still almost no leads. The only thing the detectives could present was a terrifying portrait compiled from the words of a child who had gone insane. Meanwhile, analysts from the Ministry of Internal Affairs were trying to answer the question, where are the bodies of the last 3 victims? After all, previously dismembered remains were found very close to the scene of the attack. The conclusion was disappointing. It was likely that the Ripper had acquired a car. Now the killer could make bloody raids not only in the Odintsovo district of Moscow region, but also in neighboring districts, Russky, Mojayski, Narofominsky, Dmitrovsky, or in Moscow itself. Hundreds of police officers were sent to preventive work. In addition, Moscow region investigators closely contacted colleagues from the Rostov region, where similar crimes were occurring. At that time, Andrei Chikatilo had not yet been identified, and it seemed that the same killer was operating in the Moscow region and in southern Russia. The country's top leadership decided that a large-scale military operation was necessary in the Odintsovo district. Perhaps they could discover the maniac's secret lair or find the remains of the 3 missing boys. Soldiers moved in tight formation about 3 meters apart, kilometer by kilometer, finding nothing suspicious. Then suddenly, one of them was stunned. He saw fresh bloodstains in the snow and freshly dug earth nearby. Could it be luck? Could the Moscow ghoul have just been here? Nearby, the crunch of snow was heard. Behind the bushes, a soldier saw a man with a heavy bag on his back and a shovel in his hands. Apparently, the stranger wanted to leave unnoticed. A warning shot followed. The man dropped the bag on the snow and tried to disappear into the trees. The chase was short. After a few meters, the stranger fell into the snow and raised his hands. The man begged not to shoot, assuring that he would return all unpaid taxes to the state and pay any fine. It turned out his bag contained mole bodies and skins. He caught underground animals, skinned them immediately, and just wanted to make some money. Unfortunately, the mole catcher turned out to be not the man they were hunting. The mole catcher turned out to be a law-abiding person, a father of 3. However, the large-scale operation was not in vain. They managed to find a fragment of the body of one of the missing boys. The criminal lay low. He, of course, learned that the soldiers were combing the forests. The whole Odintsovo district was buzzing about it. But the fiend could only restrain his animal instinct for 6 months. In '89, there were immediately 2 murders in a row, and again dismemberment. Rostov detectives continued to keep in touch with the Moscow criminal investigation. The crimes were indeed very similar. But gradually differences began to appear. In the Odintsovo district, children were not just dismembered. According to experts, most of the injuries the boys received were while they were still alive. Chunks of flesh were torn out of them so that the unfortunate children would remain conscious until the very end. Someone got hellish pleasure tearing off hands and legs, cutting out the insides of still living teenagers. When the head of the Odintsovo criminal investigation looked with his own eyes at the last victims of the elusive ghoul, he could hardly stand on his feet. Unprecedented forces of the Moscow region police were thrown into the search for the maniac. The head of the investigation team, Vladimir Danilov, commanded over 100 officers. There were thousands of police sergeants, warrant officers, and rank-and-file officers involved. This was truly an unprecedented police operation, possibly the only one of its kind in the history of the Soviet Union. They decided to investigate everyone, without exception, who lived in the Odintsovo district. Special attention was still given to those who might have had any skills related to dismembering bodies. Some individuals had already been checked 3 or 4 times over the course of the investigation. During the operation, it turned out that in 1990, the Rostov maniac Andrei Chikatilo was imprisoned. He confessed to killing 53 people. Chikatilo fully understood that only one punishment awaited him: execution by firing squad. He was willing to take responsibility for any crime, but after learning the details of the murders in the Moscow region, he said, "I didn't think of that. It's not my doing." Only then did it become clear that a unique maniac was operating in the Odintsovo district. In terms of caution and the perversity of his crimes, he surpassed even Chikatilo. But who was he, and why, during a thorough check of all residents in the district, had they failed to identify him? It seemed as if some phantom was dismembering children. He would strike a monstrous blow and then vanish into thin air. The Soviet Union was in its final days. The Odintsovo maniac continued his hunt. In 1992, automatic gunfire was increasingly heard in cities, and walking the streets became dangerous. Perhaps the maniac thought that now, with the police almost powerless, he would certainly not be caught. Relaxing, he made a single mistake, and that was enough for investigators to finally identify him after 6 years. In early spring of 1992, 3 teenagers disappeared. They were returning from Moscow and, after getting off the train, tried to hitch a ride. The mutilated remains of the boys were found 5 days later. The modus operandi was the same: horrific torture before death, followed by dismemberment. But miraculously, one of the boys' friends survived. He had been traveling with them on the train and, after getting off at the station, refused to get into the car, even though he knew the driver. It was Uncle Seryozha from the stud farm. Uncle Seryozha was a hired zoo technician who sometimes worked at the local stud farm. He was carefully invited to the police station under a plausible pretext to avoid raising suspicion. The suspect arrived at the station in his own Zhiguli car. The zoo technician turned out to be a man named Sergei Golovkin, a resident of Moscow. As the detectives had expected, he denied everything, claiming he knew nothing about the fate of the murdered teenagers. He expressed bitter sympathy for the parents of the victims. At that moment, there was no evidence against Golovkin. The duty investigator decided to release him. However, the head of the Odintsovo District Criminal Investigation Department, Leonid Glushko, noticed something. The zoo technician had a slight limp. As the suspect got into his car and calmly drove away from the police station, Glushko recalled the other scant details. Dark-haired, above average height, around 30 years old. At his own risk, Leonid Glushko ordered the arrest of Sergei Golovkin again. Patrol units of the traffic police reported over the radio that the Zhiguli was speeding toward the Minsk highway. Golovkin was not heading home to Moscow. Apparently, he wanted to flee to the neighboring, now independent, Republic of Belarus. All duty units received orders over the radio: detain him immediately. He must have realized that he was about to be identified and was probably trying to get as far away from the Moscow region as possible. Fortunately, the suspect's car was held up for a long time at a railway crossing. A slow-moving freight train was passing through. Those few minutes allowed the police to catch up with Golovkin. He was detained in his own Zhiguli. During interrogation, the zoo technician continued to deny everything. But when he learned that the investigators had obtained a search warrant, he turned pale. His gaze seemed to freeze. The detectives realized he was about to crack. As it turned out, Golovkin had been sleeping right at the stud farm. He had been allowed to set up a bed in the red corner. In Soviet times, the red corner was almost a sacred place. It always featured a bust of Lenin and a red banner. In such places, I had often listened to lectures about the latest achievements of the Soviet people and approved the decisions of the latest CPSU Central Committee Congresses. Such were the times. During the search of the red corner at the stud farm where Golovkin slept, nothing suspicious was found. However, in the same village near the stud farm, the zoo technician had built a garage. This is where the detectives finally got their long-awaited break. The very first search of his garage yielded evidence that implicated Golovkin in criminal activity: a knife, an axe with traces of blood, and a little later, investigators discovered a rusty trough. It was hard to believe. The killer's lair was located very close to the vacation spot of the then president of Russia. There was so much evidence that Sergei Golovkin began to give detailed confessions about where, whom, and when he had killed and dismembered the boys. The search for the remains continued day and night, but too much time had passed, and almost nothing was left of the murdered boys. Later, in the investigator's office, Golovkin recounted each murder in detail. The pattern was always the same. First, he would tie them up with ropes, torture them, then slowly kill and dismember them. The monstrous experiments on children took place in a specially equipped basement under the garage. The last 3 kidnapped boys met a particularly horrific death. The children witnessed each other's deaths. 2 of them sat together for a few minutes before dying. How could a Soviet man turn into, I have no words, a demon, a real devil? As a child, Sergei Golovkin was what you might call a nerd. He always crammed his homework. His school diploma was full of straight A's. He graduated with a medal, a quiet, straight A student. That was his profile. Golovkin had a slight physical defect. He had a slight limp in his right leg. Once, before graduation, the entire class went on a trip to the countryside. They lit a bonfire, and the boys and girls organized a round dance. The quiet Golovkin tried to join in the fun, but one of his classmates harshly rebuffed him. Nerd, limpy, where do you think you're going? After this incident, Sergei Golovkin dreamed of cruel revenge. After school, Golovkin enrolled in the Timiryazov Agricultural Academy, but for some reason he couldn't manage to have relationships with girls, even though many beauties noticed the focused, nearly 2-meter-tall, straight-A student. Golovkin preferred to live with his mother and sister in Moscow, and then he got a part-time job as a zoo technician in the Odintsovo district. There, he first saw how animals were dismembered. Once he asked the veterinarians for a favor to let him carve up a carcass himself. At the sight of raw meat, Golovkin experienced his first real orgasm. That's when the idea came to him to dismember one of the boys who loved to watch the horses. Luring a teenager into the garage near the stud farm was not difficult. After all, the local boys knew him as a kind and even timid man, especially since he chose bold, hooligan-like schoolboys as his victims. In 1987, Golovkin first read about the crimes in the Rostov region, where Chikatilo was dismembering people. He immediately felt a sense of competition. The former straight-A student first carefully studied the atrocities in southern Russia and then wanted to surpass the famous maniac, devising new inhuman experiments. During the interrogation, he admitted that he had specifically bought a blowtorch. He had a dream to burn out the eyes of teenagers while they were still alive. Fortunately, Golovkin did not have time to carry out this monstrous plan. In total, the Moscow region maniac confessed to 11 murders, but investigators are sure there are more victims. A resident of the Odintsovo district, Elena Sukomlinova, was never able to find the remains of her son Sasha. For a long time, the poor woman believed that her son was still alive. Only many years later did Elena come to terms with the tragedy. She consoles herself with one thought. Golovkin did not have time to dismember her child. Perhaps the boy, even if wounded, managed to escape into the forest. Someone told her that some teenagers had escaped the deadly trap. Today, in the 21st century, it is no longer possible to establish the truth. Sergei Golovkin was executed in 1996. He was shot in Moscow in the Butyrka prison. It was the last execution in the famous Butyrka.